Adele is the Anti-Racism and Equity Officer of the United Church of Canada. And this is such a key, important, significant role and goal for the United Church and for all of us working towards dismantling systemic racism in our churches, in our theological schools, and in our communities. And Adele, we're just so grateful that you're with us and for your work in your ministry. And over to you.
Great. Thank you, Janet, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. It's really good to be here. I'm thankful for the invitation and for this opportunity to be in conversation today. So for conversation today, I'll offer just a little bit of background and context, and then we'll move in and out of small group for further conversation. So first, a little bit of background. So I've been engaged in anti-racism work, as Janet mentioned, for quite some time in both national and ecumenical interchurch contexts. And I've noticed some trends with how people talk about racism. There's some trends that have emerged almost every time I've done an anti-racism workshop or been in conversation. So I'll offer those to you, and you might reflect on, have you heard or seen these, or excuse me, are any of them reflected in your own context? This is particular to churches, and particularly some of our mainline churches in Canada. So one, there's a trend, a thinking that racism is almost always overt and obvious, that it's almost always very dramatic. So people talk about, oh, well, you know, there was this joke that happened, or somebody said something that was outrageous, and isn't that terrible? It's almost met with this outrage. So one, this idea that it's always overt and obvious. Second, that it tends to happen outside the church. So there's something different that happens in the church because we all love one another, we're disciples of Jesus, and so on. So it's outside the church. Three, that it's that the language of white supremacy, white privilege, and whiteness are very difficult to understand and wrestle with, and particularly to see how those might be manifested in church contexts. Fourth is that the way in which racism can be systemic or subtle is difficult, as well as theologies that support racial exclusion. So that's often a struggle. And yes, so those are some of the trends, as well as the last one I would just say is the specific ways in which how racism manifests itself in church life, particularly in policies, in processes, and procedures, are difficult for people to wrestle with. So those are just some trends that I've noticed across the board over several years. And you'll notice that, you know, if you think about those trends as a whole, what it does is it means that often when people think about racism, excuse me, it's thought that it's somewhere else, someone else's issue, and that it's very dramatic. It's harder to do the inward look of how do we look at our churches, our context, our processes, our theologies, and how those support systemic racism and racial exclusion. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to delve right in there. So I'm leaving out the overt stuff. We know that that happens. But I'm going to suggest that happens a lot less than what we think. It's much more the subtle systemic forms that are ongoing, and those are the much more damaging forms. Okay, so today we're going to do this when we move into small groups, we'll do it in two ways. One, we'll explore this idea of institutional change. So how does an organization, how does an institution is becoming an anti-racist one? And then our second small group will look more specifically at an action plan. As we do this, I would invite you to think about a ministry context that you know. So you can think about whether it's your congregation, a community ministry, it can be a denominational structure, it can be a theological school, it can be anything. But if you keep in mind just one ministry context that you know, and keep reflecting on that as we engage in conversation. I'll just give us a bit more background, and then we'll look into the continuum more specifically. So from the United Church context, when we made a commitment to becoming an anti-racist denomination, you know, there was a thought that, okay, that can be a bit seemingly abstract. So what might that mean in terms of its intentionality and action? And so I wrote 7 points. I said there's 7 ways in which this can come out in terms of its intentionality and action. So I'll just offer those to you. And again, if you think about your own ministry context as we name these. So one is a continuous effort. So noting that work around anti-racism is a continual journey that demands persistent and consistent dedicated work. So I've often talked about how anti-racism is a journey, it's not a destination. We keep working on this. One of the challenges is that sometimes people think that it's almost like a check mark. Okay, I've done a workshop or I've done a thing, now I'm done. So the encouragement is to think about it as continual, ongoing process. Two, that all parts of the church are involved. So this is all of us. This is the work for all of us, whether we, I happen to be staff, but it could be all of us as ministers, as lay leaders, as anyone in the church can be involved in working towards anti-racism work. So it's not just for staff, it's not just around policy creation, it's much more. The church in all of its forms. Three, around equipping leaders. So everyone here is a leader in some way. So what are the ways in which leaders of the church can be equipped and trained to effectively integrate anti-racism work into regular ministry practice? So this might be opportunities for ongoing education, like today, but it can also mean that people have the tools and resources needed to effectively engage in anti-racism work. The next area is around engaging with anti-racist practice. So some of these practices might ask questions about how we pray, what we pray for, how we preach, what we preach about, how we read and interpret the Bible, how we name and describe Jesus, what curriculum and Bible commentaries we use, how we engage in outreach, how we work with people in our communities, and so on. So this is a practice question. It's inviting us to think about how does anti-racism get lived out practically? So yes, it's about structural change, as I've noted, but also about how does it get practically lived out in our kind of everyday life and ongoing ministry context. A couple of more. Another one is around building on history. So anti-racism is not new for this year or new for when declarations have been made. Many of our churches have been involved in various aspects of this work for decades, going back to apologies to Indigenous peoples, work on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Calls to Action, many manifestations of work around anti-racism. So my sense is that what we are doing now is a renewed work, an ongoing work that builds on work from the past. Oh, sorry, my phone. As well, I'll offer two more. One is around, another one is around building on theology. So our church's theological basis for anti-racism work, I would say, needs to be clear, explicit, and requires continual reflection. So earlier I noted, for example, that at times it's really difficult to understand the ways in which our theologies can uphold or uplift or even sustain understandings of racism. And sometimes we can look back in history and see, okay, well, I understand that better. What are the ways in which the Bible was used to justify slavery, for example? Or we can look back and challenge that. Now, however, some of our theological practices might still be uplifting, well, I would say are still, maybe not are still, sustaining racial exclusion. So what do those look like? How do we begin to dismantle it? And how do we really effectively reflect on theology? What does an anti-racist theology look like? And how do we challenge colonial notions of Jesus and Western theology? What might post-colonial or decolonizing theologies look like? So there's a bit of thinking about theology. The last area I would suggest is around strategy. And this is one area that is sometimes difficult for us to think about in churches, but some of this work needs to be thought about strategically. So how might we, we've talked about how all parts of the church might be involved. We all might have some responsibility for advancing the work, but how might we think about this work strategically? How do we know we're making progress? How do we monitor and report on the work that the church we collectively in the church are making? So a strategy to say, if this is where we are now, where do we want to be in 3 years? And how do we know that we're getting there? So really developing and building a concrete strategy for advancing the work. So those are 7 areas that I've suggested in terms of intentionality and action around becoming an anti-racist church. as we think about shifting towards engaging in further institutional change. This is a continuum on becoming an anti-racist church. So it's been developed by many of us over time, but it names kind of 6 areas on a continuum. So when you move into your small group, you may want to just skim it very quickly, and then think again about what's your ministry context. Where might you find yourself on this continuum? So the 6 areas. So one is here you have an excluding church, church of the status quo, and you can read what's there. Further down, an open church or an awakening church. And again, there's lots of information about what those are. And the last 2 are a redefining church and a transformed church. So as you read these and again, reflect on your ministry context, where might you find yourself on this continuum? There's no judgment. There's no judgment at all, but it's just an honest reflection on where might your ministry. I would suggest that there are very few that are at the transformed church stage. So you can read it and think, wow, that looks amazing. But again, no judgment. Don't feel bad if you're not there, because very few would be there. But again, think about where your church might be, or your ministry context might be in terms of that continuum, and how might you begin to shift towards the next area. So that's a reflection for your conversation in small groups, which we'll move to in a moment. The other thing, as we move into small groups, I'd invite us just to think about, for this conversation, since we're really trying to talk about how might we become an anti-racist church, and really thinking about the institutional change part, to actually focus the conversation on race and racism. It can be tempting to say, oh yes, well, that's just like sexism, that's just like poverty, that's just, I would encourage us to stay focused on the conversation about racism, to really talk about an anti-racist church. Of course, all issues are intersectional. It's not race, it's not exclusively about race. However, to have a conversation about race, sometimes we need to just have a conversation about race. So I would invite us to do that as we move into small groups, to really focus the conversation on race in relation to what you see there. So take a few minutes, read, and have a conversation about your ministry context and what you think might continue to shift us along in the continuum. Okay, so with this in mind, so again, we're thinking about how do we begin to shift an institution in its broadest sense. So looking at the systemic forms, looking at the subtle forms, how do we begin to make those kinds of movements? Part of that, as I mentioned earlier, is to think about doing this work strategically and developing a strategy. So I'm going to share some elements of what has been developed in the United Church around an anti-racism action plan. It's a 3-year plan that would go until, well, basically from now until the year 2020. So what might that look like? And are there elements there that you might be able to think about for your ministry practice? So I'll introduce it. Again, it will appear in the chat that you can download. This is a plan that was developed by one of the national committees, a very diverse committee with people from across the church, who did a lot of reflection on where are we at in this moment in time, and where might it be helpful for us to collectively move as a church, recognizing people across the church are all at very different places. So still, are there some very broad themes that we could develop? So named 5 theme areas. One theme area is around education and awareness. And then there are 3 goals that are in that broad area of work. A second is theology. So some goals that are named there as well. A third area is around advocacy. Some key goals that are named there. The 4th area around governance, like around, how our committee formation, how we make decisions, those kinds of things. So governance. And the last one is around healing and accountability. So this document will appear in your chat shortly. I just wanted to highlight the 5 broad areas of work. When you move into your small groups, the invitation would be to maybe choose one area. And again, to think about your ministry context. what might some of these goals mean? How might they be lived out? What might be a starting place? Yeah, so just take one area and really think about that, work with that in relation to whatever ministry context you might be reflecting on, and to have some conversation about that. And again, we'll come back to the large group after that, and there'll be some time if you wanted to add some additional comments to the chat. Okay, so again, this has been developed from one of the national committees in the United Church, thinking about the next 3 years, but the goals are broad enough that they can, I think, would apply for many additional contexts as well. So I'll just note a couple of things. I mean, the 5 theme areas that were named there are, I mean, they're broken out into theme areas just to kind of make them a little more easy to digest, but they're all very much interrelated. So, I mean, we do one so that it relates to the other and so on. So for me, worship is implied in theology. Worship is implied in all of it, in fact. So it's an integral part in all of this, for example. Even in education, theology is implied. So they're all, I would say, interwoven and interconnected. And I would suggest that our worship is driven by our theology. So it's absolutely essential that that is a component of the plan and how we think about it and how we deconstruct it. In terms of engaging people who may not want to engage, lots of different ways. Sometimes it's through storytelling as a starting place. And I mean, there's always lots of resources. I'll share one in a moment that is an invitational place where people can start to think about questions of race and racism. And again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, part of the particular challenge is sometimes people don't want to engage because they don't understand how racism is an issue within the church. So, and often it's, you know, a lot of times it's good, faithful people, but have just not thought about it, hasn't been part of their life experience. So what are some ways that we can invite people to engage, further the conversation, push people a little bit? Some of that's through stories, some of that might be through videos, other resources that invite people to think about the realities of ongoing racism in the church and beyond. Reimagine the image of Jesus, yes, is a big step. I don't know about you, but I grew up in Sunday school with an image of a white Jesus with long, blonde, flowing hair. Some of you are nodding. You may have had a very similar image. And it took a long time to kind of deconstruct that and realize, oh, maybe that's not a necessarily historically accurate image of Jesus. And yet those are images that get internalized from very young ages. And so how we think about Jesus, how we preach, teach, and deconstructing even colonial images around that is a really important aspect of this collective work. The question of tokenism and how to support small numbers of racialized people along the way, yes, absolutely essential, and that's woven throughout, as well as in the healing and accountability section in particular. That would be highlighted as one area. So with that, this has been part of an ongoing conversation, I would suggest. Reimagining the image of disciples, yes. This is part of an ongoing conversation about what does it mean to become an anti-racist church. We've had a couple of snippets in shorter conversation groups, but my guess is that, you know, if we had more time, the conversation in your small groups might have continued on longer. So I consider this as, you know, maybe we'll put a little comma, and that these conversations and discussion and planning and analysis might continue at another time. It's part of what we had talked about earlier in terms of the work around anti-racism work being something that's continual. So it may be that, you know, some among you may want to take some of these documents and continue to reflect on them in relation to your ministry context. There may be further conversations or further reflection, action, prayer, lots of ways to continue doing this work in various ways. So this was a conversation, but it's not a conversation that is finished by any stretch of the imagination. I'm wondering, in case some of you are looking for additional practical ideas. Yes, I do have a reading list. I'll share that with Scott so that he can send that out afterwards. As well, if some of you are looking for a practical resource, some communities are using this during Lent, we've created in the United Church a program called the 40 Days of Engagement on Anti-Racism. It's available on the website. We'll post the link in the chat, but this allows for daily reflections on various aspects of anti-racism work. So every day there's an opportunity for learning and reflection, a faith reflection, children's activity, and ideas for advocacy and action. There's also some videos that are posted there as well. So on each of those, on 7 of the themes, there's a video resource that goes a little more in depth. So this is a resource in case people wanted to use it for personal reflection. It's great for the Lenten season or any time of year. Or some people are using it for group study to say, okay, we can do this individually, and then let's come together once a week and talk about what we're learning. But would offer that as one among many resources that's available for continual action, continual reflection and action. In a moment, I'll turn it back over to Janet to close off our time. After we officially close, I'll stay for maybe another 5 or 10 minutes in case there are additional questions that we didn't have a chance to talk about in the large group. We can continue the conversation there. But first, I wanted to thank you all for your engagement, for spending the hour today in conversation about what it might mean to become an anti-racist church, how we practice this, how we begin to think about institutional change. These are sometimes not easy questions, and yet I think it's part of our collective call, and I think it can be joyful and exciting work, even as it can be challenging. So thank you again for your time and engagement, and over to you, Janet.
Adele, thanks so much. I knew this was going to be good, and it was so good, even just in the short time of an hour that we had. My small group had really rich discussions, and thank you for the resources.